Go ahead, the billionaire CEO said with a grin that drew laughter from every corner of the ballroom. Fix this, and I'll give you $100 million. The room erupted before anyone even looked at the machine resting on the polished walnut table. It was never meant to be a serious offer. It was entertainment. It was humiliation wrapped in expensive tailoring. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of executives gathered for the National Innovation Summit in Dallas, Texas, their conversations fading into amused whispers as every eye settled on one man standing quietly near the edge of the stage. Ethan Brooks didn't wear a custom Italian suit. His navy jacket had seen better years, and the leather briefcase in his hand carried more scratches than shine. To most people, he looked like a businessman whose best days had already passed. They had no idea that every morning before sunrise, he packed school lunches, braided his 10-year-old daughter's hair the best he could, and drove her to elementary school before opening the struggling manufacturing company he refused to abandon. Being a single father had taught him something success never could. Quiet dignity always outlasted loud pride. Damian Whitmore adjusted his gold cuff links and leaned casually against the table. "Come on, Mr. Brooks," he said loudly enough for the audience to enjoy every word. "I heard you used to build remarkable machines. Surely one tiny prototype isn't too much for a famous CEO." More laughter rolled across the ballroom. Phones quietly lifted. Someone expected an embarrassing moment worth sharing online. Ethan walked forward without rushing. He didn't answer the insult. He simply looked at the device. It was no larger than a toolbox, wrapped in brushed aluminum with a maze of tiny components hidden beneath a transparent panel. Several elite engineers had already failed to restart it during the morning demonstration. Damian folded his arms with unmistakable confidence. "Need me to explain how it works?" he asked. Ethan finally spoke, his calm voice almost disappearing beneath the air conditioning humming through the grand hall. "No," he replied. "Machines usually explain themselves." The laughter softened. Something about his answer carried no arrogance, only certainty. Ethan gently placed his fingertips on the side of the housing instead of reaching for the controls. He closed his eyes for barely a second, as though listening instead of looking. The ballroom suddenly felt different. Even the clinking silverware from nearby luncheon tables seemed farther away. At the back of the room, weaving carefully between white tablecloths while balancing a tray of iced tea, waitress Claire Bennett stopped walking. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't watching Damian. She was watching Ethan's hands. There was something strangely familiar about the patience in the way he examined the machine, as though he respected it instead of trying to conquer it. She had seen that kind of quiet before, years ago, standing beside someone she had loved and lost. Around her, executives exchanged amused smiles, already convinced they knew how this story would end. Claire wasn't smiling. For reasons she couldn't explain, she had the unmistakable feeling that the only person who truly understood what was about to happen was the man everyone else had already decided to underestimate. The silence lingered far longer than anyone expected. Damian Whitmore smiled as though he still controlled the room, but his fingers tapped lightly against the polished table, revealing a trace of impatience beneath his confidence. Ethan Brooks remained focused on the machine, his eyes moving slowly across every panel, every screw, every tiny imperfection that others had dismissed. He was not searching for a shortcut. He was listening for a story. Every machine carried one if someone cared enough to pay attention. Around the ballroom, conversations gradually returned in hushed voices. One executive whispered that the challenge had gone on long enough. Another quietly suggested bringing the company engineers back to the stage. A third chuckled that the single father was probably trying to think of a graceful excuse before admitting defeat. Ethan ignored every word. Years earlier, those comments might have reached him. Life had taught him to separate noise from truth. Raising his daughter had made that lesson permanent. Every morning began before 6 o'clock. He prepared breakfast, checked homework, packed lunches, and reminded 12-year-old Lily Brooks that kindness mattered even when nobody noticed. Then he drove across town to the small manufacturing company he refused to abandon despite shrinking contracts and relentless financial pressure. Some people called him stubborn. Lily called him dependable. Only one opinion truly mattered. Claire Bennett continued serving coffee with practiced grace, but her attention never drifted far from the stage. She noticed something no one else seemed to recognize. Ethan never forced a movement. He never touched a component simply because it looked important. Every gesture appeared deliberate, patient, almost respectful. It reminded her of evenings spent beside her late father in his garage, where he often said that brilliant engineers solve problems because they first learned how to ask better questions. Her father had admired only a handful of innovators during his entire career. One name had surfaced again and again around their dinner table: Ethan Brooks. She had never expected that legendary engineer to become a quiet businessman standing alone beneath crystal chandeliers while strangers laughed at him. Yet doubt lingered in her mind. Could this really be the same man? Damien finally stepped forward with another confident smile. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom. "Are you planning to repair it today, or should we schedule another conference next year?" A ripple of polite laughter followed. Ethan looked up with calm eyes that carried neither offense nor embarrassment. "Good work takes patience," he answered softly. "Rushing usually repairs pride before it repairs anything else." The laughter disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Damien forced a smile, but it no longer looked effortless. Claire felt an unexpected chill despite the warm ballroom lights. The atmosphere had shifted again. It was subtle, almost impossible to explain, like the quiet stillness that settles across open farmland moments before the first drop of rain. No announcement had been made. No victory had been claimed. Yet somewhere deep inside the crowded ballroom, certainty had begun changing sides, and Claire realized she was no longer wondering whether Ethan Brooks could repair the impossible machine. She was wondering why a man capable of such quiet confidence had allowed the world to forget who he really was. The ballroom settled into an uneasy quiet as Ethan Brooks slowly removed his jacket and folded it neatly over the back of a nearby chair. There was nothing dramatic about the gesture. It was simply the habit of someone who believed every task deserved his full attention. He looked around the table without asking for permission. His eyes stopped on a small maintenance kit that had been left beside the prototype after the previous demonstrations. He opened it carefully and selected nothing more than a standard precision screwdriver no longer than 6 inches. Several engineers exchanged puzzled glances. One of them quietly muttered, "That tool is not even designed for this system." Another shook his head. "He is wasting his time." Damien Whitmore smiled wider, delighted that the audience was still watching. "That is all you need?" he asked. "I expected something more impressive." Ethan answered without looking away from the machine. "The right answer is usually smaller than people expect." His calm reply lingered in the air, while the fluorescent display on the prototype remained dark and lifeless. Claire Bennett stood near one of the marble columns with an empty silver tray resting lightly against her side. She noticed Ethan was not examining the obvious access panel where every engineer before him had concentrated their efforts. Instead, he slowly circled the device once, studying the faint reflections along its brushed aluminum surface. His fingertips paused near one corner where a nearly invisible scratch interrupted the polished finish. He smiled almost imperceptibly, as though an old friend had finally whispered the truth. Claire remembered watching her father inspect vintage engines exactly the same way. He had always said that people searched for broken parts while great engineers searched for broken assumptions. Ethan carefully loosened one tiny screw and lifted a narrow panel no larger than a postcard. Inside, rows of immaculate circuitry reflected the crystal lights above, but his attention settled on a single connector tucked behind a protective bracket. He did not touch it immediately. He simply observed. The room grew so quiet that even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Damien glanced toward his senior engineers. None of them looked comfortable anymore. They had each inspected the same compartment earlier that morning, yet none had reacted the way Ethan had. "Find something interesting?" Damien asked, attempting to sound amused. Ethan nodded gently. "I found something honest." Confused expressions spread across the audience. Ethan continued speaking in the same measured tone. "Machines rarely fail because they want to. Most failures begin when someone assumes they already know the answer." Claire felt a chill run through her. Those words were almost identical to something her father had repeated throughout her childhood. She stared at Ethan with growing disbelief, trying to remember where she had first seen his face. Slowly, Ethan adjusted the hidden connector by less than the width of a coin, tightened the small screw, and rested both hands on the edge of the table without pressing a single button. He was waiting. Not for luck. Not for applause. He was waiting because he already understood something that no one else in the ballroom had even realized was wrong. No one moved. Hundreds of successful people stood frozen by something they could not yet explain. Ethan Brooks rested one hand lightly on the edge of the table while his eyes remained fixed on the silent prototype. He was not waiting for applause. He was waiting for the machine to finish telling its story. Claire Bennett could not look away. Every memory from her childhood returned with startling clarity. Saturday afternoons in her father's workshop. The scent of fresh sawdust mixed with machine oil. An old radio playing softly in the corner while her father patiently explained that the finest engineers never rushed a solution because understanding always arrived before action. Then she remembered something else. A faded photograph hanging above his workbench. 3 engineers smiling beside an experimental energy system that had changed an entire industry. Her father had pointed to the youngest man in that picture more times than she could count. That is Ethan Brooks, he had always said. He listens to machines the way great musicians listen to a piano. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. She looked from the photograph stored in her memory to the quiet man standing only 30 feet away. Time had added a few lines around his eyes and strands of gray to his hair, but the calm expression was unmistakable. Her father had not admired celebrities. He admired character. If this truly was the same Ethan Brooks, then the room was laughing at someone history had already respected. Damian Whitmore cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the growing silence. "Well?" he asked, forcing another confident smile. "Did your inspection impress the machine enough to repair itself?" A few scattered chuckles answered him, but they sounded uncertain now. Ethan finally reached toward the control panel. His finger hovered above a single recessed switch without pressing it. "Most people believe complicated problems require complicated answers," he said quietly. "Sometimes they simply require enough humility to notice what everyone else ignored." He pressed the switch. A soft click echoed through the ballroom. Nothing happened. Damian spread his hands dramatically toward the audience. "I believe that answers our question." Before the laughter could return, a faint blue indicator illuminated near the corner of the prototype. 1 light became 2, then 3. A gentle electronic tone filled the air as internal systems awakened one by one with perfect rhythm. Conversation stopped instantly. Several engineers stepped closer without realizing they had moved. Diagnostic screens that had remained dark throughout the conference suddenly displayed clean lines of data flowing smoothly across the glass. Cooling fans began spinning with a quiet, steady sound that resembled a slow breath after a long silence. Claire felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. She was no longer watching a repair. She was watching her father's words come alive. Ethan stepped back instead of celebrating. His expression remained peaceful, almost grateful, as though the success belonged to the people who had designed the machine rather than to himself. That single act of humility struck Claire even harder than the repair itself. In that moment, she understood why her father had spoken of Ethan Brooks with such respect. Real greatness never demanded attention. It quietly earned it. And for the first time since the challenge had begun, the people inside the grand ballroom stopped looking at Ethan as a man they could judge and started looking at him as someone they had completely failed to understand. For several long seconds, no one applauded. The only sound inside the ballroom came from the prototype itself, humming with quiet precision as every indicator remained a healthy blue. It was the sound of a problem finally solved, yet the greater transformation had taken place among the people standing around it. Faces that had worn confident smiles only moments earlier now carried expressions of disbelief. Senior engineers leaned closer to the display, reviewing the diagnostic readings again and again as though they expected the numbers to change. They did not. Every system reported perfect stability. Damian Whitmore slowly approached the table, his polished shoes barely making a sound across the marble floor. He looked at the machine, then at Ethan Brooks, then back at the machine once more. His practiced confidence had begun to crack beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. "That is impossible," one engineer whispered. Another quietly answered, "No. It is simply something we failed to understand." Claire Bennett felt herself smiling without realizing it. She watched Ethan carefully, expecting at least a trace of satisfaction after accomplishing what an entire team of specialists could not. Instead, he reached for the small screwdriver, wiped it clean with a folded handkerchief, and returned it to the maintenance kit exactly where he had found it. The gesture seemed almost insignificant, yet it revealed more about his character than any speech ever could. He respected not only the machine, but also the people who would continue caring for it after he walked away. Damien finally cleared his throat. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner than before, "a promise is a promise. $100 million. Several assistants immediately looked toward him, uncertain whether he had truly intended to honor the challenge. Ethan met Damien's eyes with the same calm expression he had carried from the beginning. "Keep your money," he said gently. The words settled over the ballroom with even greater force than the successful repair. Damien blinked in confusion. "You are refusing $100 million. Ethan nodded once. "I did not come here to win a prize. I came because something valuable deserved another chance to work." Complete silence followed. Claire remembered her father saying that integrity could never be purchased because the people who possessed it had already decided what mattered most. Standing there now, she understood those words more deeply than ever before. Damien searched Ethan's face, almost expecting him to reveal a hidden agenda or demand a different reward. None came. Ethan simply picked up his worn leather briefcase and carefully slipped his jacket back over his shoulders. The expensive ballroom suddenly seemed smaller than before. Wealth, titles, and applause had all lost a measure of their importance beside one quiet decision. As Ethan turned toward the exit, Claire noticed something tucked inside the partially open briefcase. It was not a luxury watch or an executive planner. It was a brightly colored drawing made with crayons. Across the top, in large, uneven letters, were the words, "Best Dad Ever." A gentle smile touched Ethan's face for only an instant before he closed the briefcase again. In that single moment, Claire realized the greatest success he carried into the ballroom had never been his brilliance. It had always been the little girl waiting for him to come home. Claire Bennett watched Ethan Brooks disappear into the flow of departing guests, but something inside her refused to let the moment end there. She quietly placed her silver serving tray on a nearby service station and excused herself from the banquet floor. The ballroom behind her slowly filled with conversations once again, yet the laughter that had echoed through the room earlier had completely vanished. It had been replaced by thoughtful voices, uncertain expressions, and long silences. Claire stepped into the wide hotel corridor just as Ethan reached the elevators. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking downtown Dallas, painting warm patterns across the polished stone floor. "Mr. Brooks," she called gently. Ethan turned with the same calm expression he had carried all day. He smiled politely. "Yes." Claire hesitated for a moment, suddenly feeling like a little girl standing inside her father's workshop again. "My father used to talk about you," she said quietly. Ethan's smile faded into surprised curiosity. "Did he?" She nodded. "His name was Thomas Bennett. He designed industrial control systems in Fort Worth. Every Saturday, he would tell me that if I wanted to understand engineering, I should study the people who respected machines instead of trying to dominate them. He always mentioned your name." Ethan remained silent for several seconds. The elevator doors opened behind him, but he made no effort to step inside. Instead, he looked at Claire with genuine warmth. "Thomas Bennett," he repeated softly. "I have not heard that name in many years." Claire searched his face. "You knew him?" Ethan nodded. "He was one of the finest engineers I ever worked with. More importantly, he was one of the finest men I ever knew." Claire felt her eyes fill with tears she had not expected. "He passed away 6 years ago." Ethan lowered his head respectfully. "I am very sorry." Neither of them spoke for a few moments. The quiet between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, like two people sharing the memory of someone who had quietly shaped both their lives. Claire finally smiled through the emotion. "He kept an old photograph of your research team in his garage. I recognized you the moment you touched that machine." Ethan gave a modest shake of his head. "Your father deserved far more recognition than I ever received. Many of the ideas people credit me for were improved because of him." Claire laughed softly in disbelief. "He would never have admitted that." "That is exactly why he earned my respect," Ethan replied. The elevator doors closed after waiting too long, leaving the hallway peaceful once again. Claire glanced toward the ballroom where executives were still discussing the extraordinary repair. "They all think today was about proving who was smarter," she said. Ethan looked out the window toward the bright Texas sky. "No," he answered gently. Today was about reminding people that knowledge without humility eventually forgets how to listen. Claire looked at him differently now. Not as a famous engineer. Not as a successful executive. Not even as the single father carrying a child's drawing inside a worn briefcase. She saw a man whose greatest strength had never been his brilliance. It had always been the quiet grace with which he carried it. And without realizing it, she found herself hoping this unexpected conversation would not be the last chapter they would ever share. Claire remained in the quiet hallway for several moments after Ethan Brooks walked toward the parking garage, feeling as though an ordinary afternoon had quietly become one she would remember for the rest of her life. Back inside the ballroom, however, another story had already begun unfolding. Damian Whitmore stood surrounded by attorneys, senior engineers, and members of his executive team, none of whom seemed interested in discussing the challenge anymore. Every computer connected to the restored prototype displayed the same message. The system was stable. Performance exceeded every benchmark recorded during the previous 6 months. One gray-haired engineer slowly removed his glasses and stared at the screen. "This changes everything," he whispered. Damian frowned. "It is one repaired machine." The engineer shook his head. "No, sir. It is the master calibration unit. Every manufacturing line we plan to build next year depends on the operating principles inside this prototype. Investors delayed signing because we could not prove the design would remain stable under continuous operation. Now we can." Another executive opened a financial report on a tablet and quietly added, "If these diagnostics hold through independent verification, the licensing agreement with 3 major manufacturers can move forward immediately. We are not talking about one contract. We are talking about the future of the entire company." Damian looked toward the ballroom doors where Ethan had disappeared only minutes earlier. For the first time that afternoon, he no longer saw a struggling competitor. He saw the man who had quietly protected a business opportunity worth billions without asking for recognition or payment. A younger engineer suddenly spoke up from the back of the group. "Sir, I think you should see this." He projected an archived patent portfolio onto the large presentation screen. Several original engineering drawings appeared, dated nearly 15 years earlier. The lead inventor's name stood at the top of every page. Ethan Brooks. The room fell silent once again. Damian stepped closer, reading each document with growing disbelief. The internal balancing system that everyone had celebrated as revolutionary was not entirely new. Its original architecture had been created years earlier by Ethan before the technology had been redesigned, renamed, and expanded by other companies. The repaired prototype had not been unfamiliar to him because he was lucky. It had been familiar because he had helped shape the ideas that made it possible. Claire quietly returned to collect empty coffee cups just as the presentation ended. She noticed every executive staring at the same name glowing across the enormous screen. No one laughed now. No one whispered another joke. The atmosphere had become almost reverent, as though everyone suddenly realized they had spent the afternoon questioning the judgment of the very person whose work had opened the doors they now walked through every day. Damian slowly lowered his eyes. The memory of his own words echoed uncomfortably in his mind, especially the confidence with which he had mistaken humility for weakness. At that moment, he understood something success had never taught him. Titles could command attention, money could purchase influence, but genuine respect could only be earned, and the quiet man carrying a child's crayon drawing had walked away with something far more valuable than $100 million. He had walked away with the truth, leaving everyone else to discover it only after he was gone. Damian Whitmore did not leave the ballroom with the other executives. Long after the conference staff began clearing tables and dimming the lights, he remained standing beneath the enormous presentation screen, staring at Ethan Brooks's name displayed across patents that had quietly shaped an entire generation of engineering. Success had taught Damian how to negotiate billion-dollar contracts, but it had never taught him how to admit he had been wrong. Today, he would have to learn. He turned to one of his assistants. "Find Mr. Brooks before he leaves the hotel." The young assistant hurried away while Damian slowly removed his conference badge and slipped it into his jacket pocket. For the first time in years, titles and accomplishments felt strangely unimportant. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long golden reflections across the glass entrance of the hotel. Ethan had just reached his pickup truck when he heard footsteps approaching. Claire Bennett arrived first, slightly out of breath after leaving her shift a few minutes early. "Mr. Brooks," she said with a warm smile, "I thought you might leave before I had the chance to say thank you." Ethan smiled gently. "You already did." Before either of them could continue, Damien stepped through the revolving doors. His pace slowed as he approached. Gone was the confident grin that had filled the ballroom only an hour earlier. He stopped a respectful distance away and looked directly at Ethan. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. There was no audience now. No cameras. No reporters. Only 3 people standing beneath the warm Texas sky. Ethan remained silent, allowing Damien to continue. "I judged you before I understood you. I measured your value by appearances instead of character. That was my mistake." Claire watched carefully. She had expected excuses or explanations. Instead, she heard something far rarer. Honest humility. Damien reached into his inside pocket and removed a business card embossed with gold lettering. "My company would be honored if you accepted any position you wanted. Chief Engineer, Chief Innovation Officer, Board Member, name it." Ethan glanced briefly at the card but made no effort to take it. "I appreciate the offer," he replied kindly, "but I already have a responsibility waiting for me at home." Damien looked puzzled. "You are turning down an opportunity that could change your life." Ethan smiled, and for the first time that day his expression carried unmistakable joy. He opened his worn briefcase just enough to reveal the colorful drawing tucked safely inside. "My daughter already changed my life." Neither Damien nor Claire spoke. The evening breeze stirred softly through the nearby oak trees while traffic moved steadily along the boulevard beyond the hotel entrance. The silence felt peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Damien slowly lowered the business card. "Then at least allow me to help your company." Ethan considered the request for a moment before answering. "Help the young engineers who work for you instead. Teach them that intelligence grows stronger when respect comes first." Damien nodded with genuine understanding. "I will remember that." As Ethan climbed into his aging pickup truck, Claire realized she had just witnessed something more valuable than a brilliant repair or a remarkable apology. She had witnessed a man whose greatest victories were never won in boardrooms or conference halls. They were won every ordinary evening when he chose humility over pride, family over fortune, and quiet dignity over the need to prove he was right. The drive home felt wonderfully ordinary, and Ethan Brooks preferred it that way. The evening sun settled low over the Texas horizon, turning the open highway into a ribbon of gold, while country music played softly through the aging truck speakers. His phone remained silent on the passenger seat except for one message that mattered more than every business offer he had received that afternoon. It came from his daughter. "Do not forget the science project, Dad. Love you." Ethan smiled and answered with a simple promise that he would be home in time for dinner. 40 minutes later, he turned onto the quiet street where modest homes stood beneath towering oak trees. Before the truck had completely stopped in the driveway, the front door swung open and Lily Brooks came running across the yard with the same joyful smile that had brightened every difficult season of his life. She threw her arms around him. "You made it." Ethan hugged her tightly. "I always will." Together, they carried groceries into the kitchen, laughing over a carton of eggs that had somehow survived the trip. There were no television cameras waiting outside. No executives. No applause. Only the comforting sounds of pots on the stove, the scent of fresh tomato soup filling the house, and the quiet happiness that money could never purchase. While Lily worked on her school project at the dining room table, Ethan repaired the loose leg on one of their old kitchen chairs with the same patience he had shown earlier that day. Lily watched him for a moment before asking, "Did your meeting go well?" Ethan tightened the final screw and smiled. "It reminded me that being kind is always worth the effort." She nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Later that evening, there was a gentle knock at the front door. Ethan opened it to find Claire Bennett standing on the porch, holding a warm homemade apple pie wrapped carefully in a checkered kitchen towel. She smiled shyly. "I hope I am not interrupting dinner. My father used to bake these every autumn. I thought maybe it was time someone shared the recipe again." Ethan welcomed her inside without hesitation. Lily introduced herself with the effortless friendliness only children seem to possess, and within minutes the 3 of them were sitting around the small dining table talking about school projects, old family stories, and favorite desserts instead of business deals or conference halls. Claire looked around the cozy home and quietly realized that the richest place she had visited all day was not the luxury hotel filled with billion-dollar conversations. It was this modest house filled with laughter, gratitude, and love. Days later, newspapers praised the restored prototype, Financial. Markets celebrated the renewed partnership, and Damian Whitmore publicly credited Ethan Brooks for his extraordinary integrity as much as his remarkable engineering. Yet Ethan never spoke about the challenge again. He simply returned to work, cared for his daughter, and lived the same quiet life that had shaped him long before anyone noticed his brilliance. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving your worth to the world. Sometimes it is protecting your character so completely that when the world finally discovers who you are, there is nothing left for you to prove, because dignity, grace, and love have already written the ending that success alone never could. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.